As a personal trainer, I was burnt out. I could not continue working the way I was working. My adrenal system was crashing. It was shutting down. This is what I need to do now.
I am Teri Holland, TEDx speaker. I work with individuals, groups, and teams to get better results through training in mindset, sales, and alignment of values. I help them to break through anything that holds them back, stops them, or gets in their way of having the success they want in a short period of time.
How do I keep success in mind?
It's a daily practice, always working on mindset, being focused on where it is that you're going in life, the areas you want to achieve success in.
You need to set up proper goals and then bearing in mind how to get there on a daily basis. How do you associate your podcast with all this? How the podcast has impacted your different business ventures?
My whole startup was under $100 to get started. And so as I transitioned into becoming a coach, clients just started coming to me through the podcast.
But wait, so in terms of timeline, when you launched the podcast, so you were a personal trainer to make it top of the charts.
People are so savvy to that today. And if an audience knows that this podcast is just to sell this program, and you're going to lose them.
What would you say will still be true in podcasting in 10 years?
The connections that we get through stories. Podcasting is just the modern day equivalent of sitting around the campfire sharing our stories. And that's where people relate. And that will still be true 10 years from now. Stories connect people faster than anything else.
If you had to launch a podcast in 2025, how would you do it?
I would be more intentional and strategic. I would niche down a lot more. That's important in today's podcasting world.
Teri, how do I keep success in mind?
That is a big question.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So tell me.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a daily practice. Always working on mindset, being focused on where it is that you're going in life, the areas you want to achieve success in, being mindful of those goals and your daily actions. And that's how you keep it in mind. And listen to Success in Mind.
Boom. That's a good placement. Here we go. Super smooth. So Success in Mind, obviously, for the people listening to us, because it's the name of Teri's podcast.
Yeah.
So it is a daily practice. Can you elaborate a bit on that? Like, how do you make sure that... Okay, let me rephrase this. It's super easy to get caught in the day-to-day, right? In French, we say having the head in the steering wheel, which is like, you're just like this and you're moving forward and you're not really maybe keeping the bigger picture in mind. No, hey, why am I doing all this? Like, what is it that I'm doing all this for? So what's your advice on making sure that actually, keeping success in mind? Because everything I do on a day-to-day basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, and longer time horizons is aimed towards success. And let me ask one better. Is success the ultimate goal?
Okay, great questions. So I'll elaborate first on how we keep success in mind, and then we can talk about if it's even possible or if that's the goal. Okay, so for me, it's really about, like I said, about those daily practices. And like you mentioned, it's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day stuff that life throws at us and to lose sight of what it is that we want. And in fact, that's a really normal thing. You have a conscious mind and you have an unconscious mind. Your conscious mind is the goal setter. You decide consciously, this is what I want, this is where I'm going. But your unconscious mind is the goal getter. It drives the bus. So 95% of our lives is controlled by our unconscious minds. Our conscious mind is only in charge of 5%. Now, why this is important is because so often people try to achieve their goals consciously, but your conscious mind can only focus on really what's right in front of it. And that's where we get distracted by the day-to-day things. So let's say, for example, a person who sets a goal in their business to make more money over the next month. And at first, they're really focused on it, and they start out the month strong, and they're doing all the things they need to do to make more money. But then their kid gets sick, or their car breaks down, or a bill comes in that was unexpected, or something happens and they have to take care of, whatever that could be. Something comes up. And immediately their attention is diverted over to the thing that needs their attention right now. And the unconscious mind just goes back to the old behaviors of, well, this is what we do every day. This is what we do. This is the old behaviors that are ingrained into us to take care of. So the moment, if we're trying to achieve our goals consciously, the moment the conscious mind gets refocused on something else, the unconscious mind just goes back to old behaviors, what it's programmed to do. When we work with the unconscious mind, then the unconscious mind takes on those changes, and that's when it becomes really easy to maintain habits, no matter what's going on in your life. So whether it's in your business, in your personal life, if you're focused on your health goals, no matter what area of life it is, if your unconscious mind is on board with achieving this goal and has accepted those changes, it becomes really easy. Then it's like swimming downstream instead of going against the current.
I like that analogy. Oh, so much to deep dive into. 5%. Well, how do you come up with that number? Like, what do you mean? Like, our conscious mind only control 5% of what exactly?
Yeah, your day-to-day activities, your habits, your behaviors.
Okay. And so that 5%, where does it come from? Like, do we know that your unconscious mind is, at the end of the day, gonna be 95% responsible for your habits and so on? Like, how do we come up with that number? Because that clearly, and the reason I'm asking this is, it's clearly highlighting the importance of looking into your unconscious mind, which I guess is the tricky part. So how do you come up with that number specifically?
Yeah, so I didn't come up with it.
Okay.
I'm not that smart. I did not come up with it. Okay. I believe it comes from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's book Flow. Is where it was, but it's been talked about by so many psychologists, hypnotherapists, that I'm not sure who originally came up with it, but you can find it in all kinds of books of psychology, neurolinguistic programming, hypnotherapy, and it's there. Yeah. But it is, I mean, it does highlight the importance of the unconscious mind in terms of achieving success. And that's where the name Success in Mind came from, was working with our minds, working with your unconscious mind to create habits and change for success.
So let's get down to it. How do you walk with your unconscious mind? How do you, manage it so that it actually helps you, get where you want to go?
Yeah. Well, your unconscious mind is always working for you. So it's not like it's not working for you right now, and then you have to do something to turn. It's always doing its job. And it's very simple. So your unconscious mind is wired based on the thoughts you feed it and what goes into it. So if you want to change how your unconscious mind is behaving, you want to change your behavior and work with your unconscious mind, it's about changing what you feed your mind. Yeah. And it always works for you. I'll give you an example of how this works.
Yeah.
So do you drive a car?
I do.
Okay. So there was a point in your life where you didn't drive a car, right?
Indeed.
Right. And do you remember the very first time that you got behind the wheel of a car to drive?
I don't actually.
You don't? Okay. Well, let me describe to you what it might have been like. And this might...
Describe me my first experience with a car.
Yeah, this might have been it. So generally, the first time a person gets behind the wheel of a car to drive it, they're thinking consciously of all the steps. They have to figure out which pedal does which, and what mirror do I need to look out of when, and what is this lever and what does that lever do, and if I steer the car this way, what happens, and how much do I need to steer it?
Yeah.
And all while paying attention to everything around you. So that's conscious. That's conscious learning. So you're aware of everything, you're thinking through every step, and it's overwhelming the first time. Or the first several times a person drives, you're thinking through everything.
Yeah.
So now, if we think about the last time you got in your car to drive, did you think about it, or did you just get behind the wheel and go?
So I just got behind the wheel and went, and I was like, shoot, I'm going to be late for my interview with Teri. So I was like, fast to my podcast studio. So I was for sure not thinking about all the things I was doing. If anything, I was probably thinking about where are the speed radars, so I make sure I do not get flashed.
There you go. Okay, so don't speed.
Yeah.
Drive safely for everyone who's listening.
Important message.
That's because you were able to do that, though, even though your mind was thinking about, I'm running late, I got to be on time, I got to get there, where are all the speed traps? Your conscious mind is busy with that. Your unconscious mind drove the car because your unconscious mind knows how to do that.
Interesting.
So all learning, change, and behavior is unconscious. And that's not to say we don't learn it consciously first or decide something consciously first. But by the time the change or the learning happens, it's unconscious. So it's learning how to direct your unconscious mind the way you want it to work. But it's always working. It's just delivering you what it is you ask for every day.
Is that what you want, though? Should you not be very much conscious about what you're doing in the present, wouldn't the point actually to be,
Yeah, you want to be aware.
Right.
You want to be aware of what you're doing and clear-headed. And that's the conscious mind's job.
Right.
But if you, think about it this way. You take in about, and there's a discrepancy here depending on who we listen to, but we'll take the average that people accept, which is about 40 million bits of information per second every day.
Reasonable.
So your unconscious mind takes in all this information. It's way too much for your conscious mind to ever handle. So we go through a process of deletion, distortion, and generalization. So you take in all this information, you delete what's not important to you, you generalize experiences. So if you experience something that's you've kind of experienced before, you'll generalize it under the same label in your mind. And if it's something you haven't experienced before, you'll distort it to be like something you have experienced to understand and make sense of it. And then you'll group all that information together in groups of 7 plus or minus 2. That's how our minds like to store information. And by the time that's all done, you're left with about 124 to 140 bits of information out of 40 million every second of every day. So your unconscious mind is doing this process constantly for us, taking in information, filtering it, organizing it, storing it away. The conscious mind can't do that. It can't even be aware of all that information at once. It's too much. So the job of your conscious mind is to be aware of what's in front of you and what you need to focus on in this moment, and that's it. It can't do the rest of it.
Oh, I love this. So those 40 million bits of information, what is it? Is it from the 5 senses? Is that where all the information points are coming from?
Yeah.
That's super interesting.
Exactly.
Maybe a completely dumb question, but somebody who would be blind, for instance, are they receiving less bits of information, or they are developing the acuity of perceiving more bits of information through other senses?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
That's so
when
cool.
You hear, you've probably heard before how people who they lose their sight and their hearing becomes so much more intense, or they develop a stronger sense of taste. All the other senses become heightened. They're still taking in just as much information, just through different channels.
So there is a way to train your unconscious mind to perceive even more bits of information.
I would say maybe not more, not to train it to take in more. But if we look at over the years, we went from 2 million bits of information per second.
Yeah.
And then when I did my training in neurolinguistic programming, it was 11 million bits. And now they're saying the general consensus is 40 million bits. So we get an upgrade as more and more information is coming at us constantly. Our brains are speeding up and taking in more and more information.
What's the impact of short form media platforms on that amount of information that we received in a specific format? Does that have an impact on the unconscious mind?
Yeah. So I don't know specifically how it impacts the unconscious mind. I'm sure that it does. I do know that it creates really fast, rapid dopamine hits.
Right.
So people they're looking at the screen and they're scrolling through videos and they're watching these short form contents, and it's releasing dopamine, and that becomes highly addictive.
And so in that sense, that gets in the way of proper solicitation through sight and ears maybe, and you become oblivious to the rest for that short period. Let's tie this back to success.
Okay.
Can you define success the way you see it for Success in Mind?
Yeah. So the way I see it is simply the achievement of goals. Okay. So are you getting what you want, or you're not getting what you want in life? To me, success is you get what you want.
Love that. How do you define good goals then?
Yeah, great question. So a good goal is, we can define it we can use the SMART goal principles. So is it specific? Is it measurable? Is it achievable? Is it realistic? And is it based on time? So we could break it down that way. But one trap that I see a lot of people falling into is they think they're setting a goal, but it's really a state or it's a value. And I'll give you an example. A friend of mine said to me one day, she said, I just want to feel successful. And I said, okay, well, what does that mean? And that was in the context we were talking about what her goals were. And she said, I just want to feel successful. And I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, well, I just want to wake up feeling successful every day. And I said, do a crossword puzzle. You'll feel successful. You accomplish it, you'll feel successful. And she said, well, that's not what I mean. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, it's just a feeling I want. I said, so do a crossword puzzle or make your bed. you'll feel successful. You accomplish something that day. So the feeling, if it's a feeling that someone's after, that's a state. Or if they want to be more confident, for example, that's a state. Or you can have that right now. And this is what I ended up telling her, is if you want to feel successful, all you have to do is do something right now to feel successful. You'll feel successful. You can have that right now. Goals take time. So if you can have it now, it's not a goal. If you can achieve it simply by thinking about something. So if you want to feel more confident, you can think of a time you felt confident, put yourself back into that memory, into that same state, you'll feel confident. That's not a goal. So goals need to take time to develop. And a lot of people confuse those things. Or they'll have a word for the year. A lot of my clients like to do this. They like to have a word of the year. And I'm like, that's great. That's a theme.
Okay.
That's not a goal. So their word of the year might be growth for their business. This is the year of growth. Yeah. Okay, but what does that mean? And so that might set a direction for the goals, that if that's the theme, that's the state, that's the value we want to achieve, then what are the things that would fall under it? How would you know when you've achieved growth? And that begins to shape our goals.
So to be successful, you need to be setting up goals successfully.
That's right.
It's a bit the chicken and the egg, Teri. No, that makes sense. And I like that smart approach. It's like, okay, growth. But indeed, you can very much be, okay, growth is a value. How do we transform that into a goal?
Yeah.
What's the acronym SMART for again? So
specific.
Specific, okay. Growth in revenues, yearly revenues and profits. Okay.
Even
measurable.
More specific than that.
Okay.
Yeah. So your unconscious mind, remember your unconscious mind is the goal getter. Yeah. And it needs really clear instructions to follow. So if you say something like, we want to make more revenue, well, how much more? Because if you make $5 more between now and the end of the year, you made more revenue. So what specifically do you want? So we want to avoid, when we're setting goals, we want to avoid words like more or better, less, anything ambiguous. So we want to be really, really clear.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, and then measurable. Yeah. So we get into a specific number. So we're not going to say 10% more. We're going to say, here's the dollar amount it has to be. Okay. And we also want to be specific of, is this revenue? Is this net? What is this number? Is it profit? Is this my take-home salary? What is this? What's that number going to be?
Love that.
Yeah. And then it needs to be achievable. So is this something that you can do?
Yeah.
Now, I'm pretty out there with goals. I like to be pretty big and broad with them and audacious, but we still it still needs to be achievable. Like if I say I want to make $1 million by tomorrow morning.
You have less than 24 hours left, Teri.
Exactly. Then I better get to work. Someone like Elon Musk can probably achieve that
100%.
Exponentially more. He'll probably make like 10 billion between now and tomorrow morning. But it needs to be achievable based on where you are now and where you want to be and the resources you have available, which is also in alignment with realistic. Is this realistic?
Yeah.
And then the time it takes to achieve it.
For information, Elon Musk is making $54,550,000 every day.
Okay, so a little less than I expected. I thought he could do. I was like 10 billion.
Yeah, that's pretty solid. That's maybe what Apple is making a day. Oh no, that would be huge as well.
That'd be huge. Yeah.
3,650 million. That's too much. Who's making 10 billion a day, Teri?
I know.
Well, if you have the recipe for that, please take me there.
Yeah. Me too.
Okay, love this. So, success in mind. Need to set up proper goals, and then bearing in mind how to get there on a daily basis. So those daily habits that will allow you to achieve your SMART goal or whatever framework you use for your goal. Cool. Why the podcast? Why launching a podcast helping people keep success in mind? What was the intention behind that?
It was really simple. I launched my podcast in 2015.
Okay.
And it wasn't success in mind then. It was the empowered life. I've rebranded a few times and gone through a few different iterations of it.
Okay.
But the reason was simple. I was going through a rough time in my life. I needed something. And I went to an event. There was a speaker talking about podcasting.
Okay.
And it sparked something in me. And I thought, I could do that. I can do what he's talking about. I know how to do this. And I went home and set it up. And I wasn't thinking about how it would grow my business. I wasn't thinking about it being successful. I just needed a creative outlet for me at that moment.
The idea was to empower life, right? Is that the name? Okay. So what was the idea back then? To just have a repository of all your thoughts, or what did you want to achieve with that?
Pretty much. I just wanted a place where I could share ideas about personal growth and development and help people to live better lives. And that was it. I really didn't think too much about it because I didn't think anyone would listen to it. I thought, maybe some of my friends might listen. At the time, I was a personal trainer. I wasn't doing what I do today. And I thought maybe some of my clients might find it interesting. Maybe my mom, if she could figure out where the podcast app was on her phone. And
mine still hasn't.
Yeah, mine hasn't either. She's never listened to it. But I thought, that it would be fun for me. That was it. I didn't give it much more thought than that.
That makes sense, right? You just started it, took action, which I appreciate. 360-something episodes later, you have a very successful podcast. So how did you take it from that repository of your thoughts, something that you think might be fun to do, hoping that maybe your friends will listen, maybe not, to something that is such a powerhouse of your brand? How did you get it there?
Yeah, by accident.
Cool. Good playbook.
Yeah, exactly. Just do what I did. Just exactly. By accident. Yeah. So, like I said, I didn't think anyone was going to listen to it. And then about 2.5-3 weeks later, it was #1 in self-improvement on iTunes. I thought it was a mistake. I thought the podcast algorithm's favoring me because it knows it's my show. So it's putting it at the top. But it won't be #1 for anyone else. I didn't know how the algorithm works. So I thought it's only showing me this on my phone. And then I checked on my husband's, and I had my best friend check his phone, and it was #1. And I think what got me there is when I launched it, I was so excited to do it. I was releasing an episode every day, and I think that built up a lot of momentum really quickly.
That's interesting.
So I got to #1 only for a day, and then I was back in the top 50, kind of circling around. But people were listening, and it started to grow and started to take on sort of a life of its own, and it just kept growing and expanding from there. So
that is pretty solid to take it in a couple of weeks to the top 1 of the Apple Podcast chart. So for context, for people listening to us, the podcast scene in 2015 was nothing like what it is right now. You had much less people listening to podcasts, though not that much less, but certainly much less podcasts out there. So it was slightly easier to rank, but that's still quite insane.
Yeah.
That's impressive. So publishing an episode a day might have helped, but for sure you had good content as well. How did you? And that's what we believe in. That's content is above everything. If you release great content, people will engage with it. They will listen till the end. They will recommend it, right? And basically, if you don't have a podcast that grows on itself, there is no point in marketing it because you need to fix the product first. Clearly, you had that recipe from the get-go, right? If you get in the top 1 of the Apple Podcast charts. But how did you position the content to make it and produce it in a way that would get listened to like this and ramp up that fast? Were you intentional about it? How did you do that?
I wish I could say I was intentional, that I went in with a content plan, but I had no idea what I was doing.
Okay.
And so my whole process was I would sit down at my desk, I'd open GarageBand, that's what I record on at the time, and I'd hit the red button and I would talk, and whatever came out is what came out. I wouldn't edit anything other than to add in my little intro that I had made for me on Fiverr.
Okay.
I'd add my intro in, and then I would download it, publish it. That was it. That was the whole process. I would talk until I was done talking, and I would hit stop. That was it. And I just shared what was on my mind, what I was thinking about, ideas, and always related back to personal development and growth. Other than that, it was just me talking. And I think maybe reflecting back, what would have worked or what did work was the authenticity of it.
Yeah.
That it was really raw. Around that time, my father was dying of cancer, and I talked about going through that. I talked about the grieving process. That episode, there was one episode called Grief. It was one of my earliest episodes. And it is to this day my #1 episode. It always shows up time after time on my top 10 for downloads of the month. People go back to it. I've had people write me emails, send me messages about that episode. So I think it was just me being authentic and sharing my own journey that made it very relatable.
And clearly it helped people, because otherwise, I mean, why would they listen to it? So
right.
Hats off
Thank
to
you.
this. Although the circumstances obviously are not what you would like, but that's impressive.
Thanks.
Why the rebrand? Why not sticking to, empowered life, since it literally allowed you to make it to the top one of the charts?
Yeah. So it's kind of a funny story. I trademarked the empowered life. I was very invested into that name. Then one day I went to a numerologist and she said that name, the empowered life, had a karmic debt on it and that I had to change the name. And so just like that, I changed the name, and she recommended renaming it the Teri Holland Show, which it was for years after that. And then just about, I guess, almost 2 years ago, I had the idea one morning that success in mind was the direction to go in. So pardon my ignorance, Teri, but what is a numerologist? Oh, yeah. They're people who study numbers, and they attach a number value to every letter in the alphabet. And so by doing that, by converting everything to numbers, they can kind of work out an equation for it and give you what the meaning or the energy of that number is, and if that's good, if it's not good, if it's aligned with you or not. And so based on her advice, I changed it. So what was the impact of that change? Nothing. For the Teri Holland Show? I would say nothing changed. The audience didn't change. Nothing changed. Really, nothing changed. I think what it did do for me was because I kept coming up with resistance to the show. I wasn't consistent in producing it. I kept being challenged by it. She said it was because of the name that was creating the friction, and that by changing the name, it would be easier for me to produce it and be consistent with it. So, and that did happen. Now, whether it happened because she said it would, and so that was a suggestion into my unconscious mind, and I believe that was true, or whether it happened because there's energy to these numbers and to words, and it made a difference, I couldn't tell you. But I know I felt better producing it after. That's interesting, though. Yeah. Because maybe what kept you going was the fact that you were feeling good about it, and the change was at the origin of that. So that's an interesting one. And success in mind, why is that? Yeah, so that just came to me in a moment of inspiration, where I was teaching. I teach people how to podcast, and I was teaching a course online for podcasters and taking them through a 1-week process of how to get started. And we had just been, the day before, we were talking about how to name your show. And so we were going through this process and brainstorming ideas for different names of their shows. And then I woke up in the morning and it was success in mind came to me. And I sat on it for about a month because I was like, do I want to change the name again? Should I do that? Is that the right thing? But it kept sticking with me, and I kept thinking about it. And I thought, okay, if I can't stop thinking about this, and this is probably the direction I need to go in. A few years later, after that, because you were a personal trainer, right, back then, now you're a public speaker, you're a coach, you're teaching people. Yeah. What's the role? I mean, how do you associate your podcast with all this? How would you say the podcast has impacted your different business ventures, if at all? Is there anything there? Oh, absolutely. So at the time that I started the podcast, I was in such a crossroads in my life. I was burnt out as a personal trainer. I knew I wasn't going to do that anymore. I had literally burnt out, where my doctor was telling me I could not continue working the way I was working. So I was also looking for a change and something else to do. Through that process, I really lost my identity. I thought I loved personal training. I love the fitness industry. I love nutrition. And I thought, this is what I'm meant to do. This is my purpose. I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. And then suddenly it was taken from me. And my doctor told me I could only train clients 2 mornings a week for a couple hours. I wasn't allowed to work out myself anymore. My adrenal system was crashing. It was shutting down. Righty. Yeah. And so I had to rest. She called it aggressive rest, which meant that I would, I know, right? It seems so. I love that. Yeah, I asked her, what is aggressive rest? And she said it means you are going to, you can work 2 mornings a week. That was our negotiation. And she said the rest of the time you are at home, you're going to lie down, you're going to read books, watch movies, sleep a lot, and allow your body to recover. And she said, if you don't do this, you'll end up in the hospital. So choose which path do you want, really. No brainer. Yeah. And so I felt lost because this is what I thought I was going to do the rest of my life. And I thought, this is my purpose. And so I started the podcast because I needed something to do and focus on. I was going through my own personal growth journey. And around this time, I met a coach who introduced me to NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, hypnotherapy, timeline therapy, all the tools I work with now. And I saw such a quick change in myself and in my mindset that I thought, this is what I need to do now. This is what I need to learn. And a few months later, I set out to train in NLP at the practitioner level. And then I continued with it and did all the trainings all the way up to becoming a master trainer. That changed my life. But where the podcast came in is the podcast gave me a global audience. And I didn't realize the power of podcasting when I started and how quickly I could connect with people online. And it didn't cost much money to start.
It did.
Right? Like it was, I think I paid, my whole startup was under $100 to get started.
Oh, yeah.
Like very
simple. That sounds about right.
Yeah. And then suddenly I had this global reach and people were listening to me all around the world and it started bringing me clients. And so as I transitioned into becoming a coach, clients just started coming to me through the podcast. So it was really like they grew hand in hand together.
And that's absolutely amazing. But wait, so in terms of timeline, when you launched the podcast, so you were a personal trainer, you launched the podcast, you make it top of the charts, and then you have people who come in to have you as a NLP coach, as a, dare I say, life coach, helping them through other things in life that just fitness training, right? So did you have an offer back then? Or because the demand was coming in so fast that you're like, I need to help those people, so let's figure something out?
I was already kind of on that journey. So as a personal trainer, I was naturally progressing into coaching already. I had built a very successful personal training brand and business. And so I had other trainers coming to me and saying, how do you always have clients? Where do your clients come from? How are you marketing yourself? And I started coaching them and I developed a process to coach them of how to set up their business successfully, how to generate consistent revenue month after month, how to market themselves. And through that, I started thinking, maybe I want to get a coaching certification. So I did just a basic life coaching certification first. And then my whole business fell apart because my health fell apart. And then it kind of pushed me further into the coaching arena. But I was already on that path. So in terms of an offer, I just had a very basic coaching offer. This is what I charge. This is how long we work together. It was just one simple offer.
You already had the authority and trust, thanks to the podcast. You already had the audience, thanks to the podcast. And you already basically had not a system in place, but people coming in because they were just like, hey, this is great.
Yeah.
Just help me out.
Yeah.
That's the best case scenario.
Yeah.
If you had to launch a podcast in 2025, Teri, how would you do it?
I would still do it the same way in terms of creating a volume of content at the very beginning.
Interesting.
But I would be more intentional and strategic. I would niche down a lot more. I think that's important in today's podcasting world when you're starting, is to have a really clear niche. I was speaking about personal growth and development, and it was for whoever wanted it. But today, I would say to get really specific and niche down into who you're speaking to, why they need to listen to your show, what it is you're providing them, and then to have some kind of unique approach in your podcast that you don't sound like everyone else. Like, what are you doing that's different?
So niching much more down, it's so funny. I had Johnny Dumas on the show who said exactly the same thing. He's like, you cannot, so Teri, same level as John. Well. It was like, I would choose a niche as narrow as pickable for people above 60 years old in South Africa who also love something. It was like the importance of niching down today is just paramount. You have much more podcasts than before. Still tons of room. There are more people searching for podcasts now than blogs. Yet you literally have 1 billion blogs out there and only 4-point-something million podcasts. So there is room. But niching down, especially in our day and age where people want very specific content when they look into a topic, that makes a lot of sense. Niching down, lots of episodes released at the beginning. That's a good one, actually. That's a lot of work, but that does make sense. So you don't have an audience yet. You're starting the podcast, and you're like, you need to achieve the same level of success that you did very successfully with this podcast. How do you keep success in mind for that? Oh, mic drop.
I'm not even sure I know how to answer that in terms of linking it to an offer, because I think...
Interesting.
Just me personally, I think if you're just going into podcasting solely to sell an offer, maybe that's not the right way to do it. I think it's more important that you have something that you want to say and something worth saying.
The value in a niche first.
Yeah. And then from there, if you do it well, people are going to want to work with you. They're going to want to know more. And you'll get a sense of, okay, this is what the audience is needing. And I think it can evolve organically and naturally from that.
Yeah.
But I think if you start the podcast because you want to sell this thing, people are so savvy to that today. And if an audience knows, like, they'll pick up on that right away, that this podcast is just to sell this program.
Yeah.
And you're going to lose them. People don't want to be sold to. They want to be educated. They want to be entertained. But they don't want to be sold.
That makes a lot of sense, Teri. So there is another aspect of your podcast that led to a certain success, which I want us to spend a bit of time on.
Sure.
Public speaking. So what was the TEDx again about? Like, what was the name of it?
Yeah. So the name of it is Living in the Shadows of PTSD.
Ah, yes.
And
correct.
Yeah, it's outside of the topics I generally speak on. This one is very personal to me, and I'm talking about the effects of secondary trauma.
Yeah.
So when you're not the person who went through the trauma, but you're close to the person who did, and how does that affect you? And I relate it to my own story of being the wife of a police officer with PTSD, and how I was affected by his trauma and had to come to terms with the fact that, yes, it was affecting me. And then dealing with the layers of guilt and shame that, well, how dare I be affected by it because I'm not the one who even experienced it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's funny. See, I mean, it's all a matter of perception at the end of the day, always, right? We are in the world of perception. But it's like, I wouldn't even think about feeling guilty for, being impacted by somebody's trauma. It's not undermining their trauma, for sure. But it's like, that's interesting. So yeah, definitely, that would need some support. And so, was that linked to the podcast at all? Like, were you able to leverage the podcast into doing this TEDx talk, or was it completely unrelated?
Completely unrelated. I mean, it might have helped my application to get into it, to doing it, because I have a following, but no, completely unrelated.
I love this sentence from Jeff Bezos when it comes to Amazon, right? When he started it and it was on the verge of failure every other day. He was like, our top priority is going to be customer and customer success. And he kept on saying, everybody asks, what is going to change in 10 years, right? Like, what will be the new paradigm? What will have changed in 10 years that we can kind of anticipate? And he's like, but very little people ask, what is still going to be true in 10 years? Like, what is not going to change that we need to double down on? In the case of Amazon, that is, people are still going to want fast, still going to want cheap, if not cheaper, still going to be treated well, right? They will want to be having a good treatment from customer service and so on, return whatever it needs to be returned. So like cheap, fast, quality. What would you say will still be true in podcasting in 10 years that podcasters should double down on?
I think what will still be true is the connections that we get through stories. Stories connect people faster than anything else. Yeah. And podcasting, we could say podcasting goes all the way back to cavemen sitting around a fire telling stories about the hunt that day.
Indeed.
Or where they found the best berries or whatever it was that they were sharing and their stories. Podcasting is just the modern day equivalent of sitting around the campfire sharing our stories. And that's where people relate. And that will still be true 10 years from now. And if you know how to tell a good story and connect with people through stories, you'll be okay.
Teri Holland, ladies and gentlemen. Teri, if people want to find out more about you, check out your content, where should they go?
The best place would be my website. It's teriholland.ca. And you can connect to everything else through there, to the podcast, to all my coaching offers, my social media, everything links through there.
Absolutely awesome. Teri, we'll put all the links in the description. And thank you so much for coming on Podcast Gurus.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.